I am back. The excitement continues with the build of this Truggy 8 scale car that I am doing. And we are going to start the first build with, we're just going to go through the bags, and bag A is the differentials. And so we're going to start with the differentials. And just a reminder, these differentials, I'll point out some of the differences with other cars, but for the most part, you're going to put a differential together the same regardless of the car. So feel free to reference this video really for any of the car builds that you do. And like I said, I'll point out some of the differences. All right, so going into table view, and you can see I've already opened up all of bag A, and I like to lay my stuff out. It gives you a visual if you've gotten everything. It allows you to kind of inspect parts to see if they're different, and just to confirm the details and contents of the bag. Couple quick things that I noticed on this build that I thought were interesting. The differential housings, they actually all look the same, but I did notice there's actually, if you kind of look on here at the top there's a number 1 on that diff housing, there's a number 2 there, and then there's a number 3 on the last one. And so I just thought I'd put them together, 1 the front, 2 the middle, and 3 the back. The other thing that's interesting, most cars I've built have Outdrives. They're the same front and rear, and sometimes they're also the same center, and sometimes they're different the center. Well, on the associated cars, they have these Outdrives labeled. So you can see here 17 on this one. And so the 17s, they actually go in the front and center diff. And then the rear diff, you can see, has a 15. And so the 15s go in the rear. And everything else looks pretty straightforward. We got all the hardware over here, and then the main build here. All right, so let's get started on this build. Couple quick notes. I like to look at these diff housings, this edge where it seals, and make sure they're flat. If they're not flat, I get some 600 grit sandpaper and just do a couple swirls, maybe figure eights, to make sure they're flat. Like sometimes there'll be flashings on here. The AE ones are all really good. So I'm not going to do that on the AE ones. Tools, I got some medical forceps I like to use to put in the pens for the Outdrives. And I like to use this red N Tacky Grease. I get it from the O'Reilly's Auto Parts store. And then I just took it out of the container it was in and put it in this Tic Tac container. So that's not a standard container that comes in. So getting started here, and I actually started putting this together and realized I'm so used to building other differentials that I was putting the shims in the wrong spot for the Outdrives. So we're starting up again, which is why those O-rings are a little red, because I'm starting that over. So what I do is I get these O-rings, I put some grease on one of these hex drivers, and I just kind of roll that grease on, and I get it on both sides. Then I'll use this hex driver to drop the O-ring and the housing and kind of push it on in there with my finger. We'll get the second one and kind of do the same thing. Just get some grease on this hex driver, and you can roll it a little bit to let the grease come off of it. And again, get grease on there, and then you can just drop it straighten that one and push it down with your finger. Next step here is putting these outdrives in, and you'll notice, I'm going to pull one of these just for a minute because they're not greasy, but you'll notice there's a slot right in here, and you want to fill that slot with grease. And so the same thing here, you get some grease on your hex driver here, and then you can kind of just lay a nice little bead in there. And then these are the little guys that I forgot the first time, so you can drop this on. It'll take some of the spooge out of there. I think actually I'm going to put a little more on just to be safe. Right in there, this little gap. Wipe that off. And then you'll drop, let's put the bearing on first. We'll regret that later too. And then you can drop this outdrive in here, and I'll kind of like spin it as I drop and put my finger inside to try to hold that O-ring in place and kind of spin it. And the O-ring did not stay in place. But anyway, so then if you do get the O-ring to pop out, you can kind of see it popped out on me. You can just take one of these sun gears and push it down and maybe rotate it a little bit. And there we go. It's in place now. And then we'll do the same thing with this one. Just fill her up with some grease. Actually, I really should be putting these on first. Like I said, I'm not used to putting shims in here. Most cars don't have them in here. They have them, I'll show you when we build it, on the other side normally. Yeah, easy for me to forget that. But here we go. We get the bearing. Oh, by the way, too, the bearing has a metal shield on one end and a rubber shield on the other. And you always want the rubber shield to go out. So that protects these bearings from the elements of the dirt that stick out in the gearbox. So always have the rubber shields out. Okay, so we'll do the same thing here. We'll kind of hold this O-ring with my finger and twist this around until it goes in. This one's a little easier. You can kind of push that down. If you don't get it all the way down, again, you can use this sun gear to kind of push it in there. And there we go. That one's in there. Wipe my hands off here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to get these pins that hold the outdrive in, and this is where I use these forceps. You can grab one of these pins with the forceps, and is what you want to do is you want to get this hole to line up with these slots in the diff housing, so you have enough room to fit this pin in, like so. So yeah, you just, hopefully you guys can see that. There we go. You just drop that pin in and get that pin centered in there. And then you can drop this sun gear. You'll see there's a notch in the sun gear for that pin to drop into. And so you'll just kind of rotate the outdrive until that sun gear drops in. It's almost level there with the top of the sun gear. The outdrive shaft is. So then we'll do the same thing again here with the other side. We'll push that in like so, like that. Wipe off that little excess there. And then we'll drop again, the sun gear in like so. Final step I like to do to get all the grease out of the way is you get these diff gaskets, and I like to lubricate them on both sides just to make sure. Just a really thin film of grease on these things. That's a little much grease there, but just a thin film of grease. It helps the gasket when you place it to stay in place, but also I think it does a lot better job of sealing up. Like I said, just a fine coat of grease to help seal that diff up. And then you can stick this thing in. I'm gonna get rid of that right there. There's a little excess grease. You can stick that thing in like that. Wipe my hands off. And you can just kind of push this thing in. Make sure you line up those holes before you go too crazy. Then you just push this thing in with your hex driver like so. Alright, so the next thing I like to do, and by the way, I'm using 10K for this front diff. I'm just building this with the kit setup. You know, I looked on AE's website and they don't have any other setup sheets listed, so we're gonna try the kit setup. But I like to put a little bit of diff oil in here at first in the bottom, just kind of where it goes over the sun gear. And then I will come in here and I will build these planetary gears. The gears on, and we get these little washers in here, and these are pretty thin, so make sure you only get one washer per side. And then finally you got this notch in the center, and you want this notch to sit up for the first one. So you stick that in like so. And get one more of these, build it the same way. Planetaries, and they're pointing towards each other. Grab a washer, another washer. These washers on the planetary gears, not all cars use those either. Some do, some don't. And then this notch on the shaft that these are on, you want to point that down so it will fall into the other notch, like so. And then I kind of just spin this thing around just to get the oil that I put down in there mixing around a little. And then finally you come in here and you fill this thing up. Fill in all the gaps. I like to get some in these little holes where the cross pins fall in, and just fill those holes up. And then fill this up. And you know, the manual tells you to fill it up right to the top of this smaller part of the planetary gear. And so we're maybe a little higher than that, but pretty good. Some people will actually put this sun gear in here and then just wipe off the excess. But I prefer to build mine this way. So I'll just kind of wipe that down a little bit just to make sure it doesn't come out when I do this. And then, you know, you just want to make sure you line up the holes here with the holes on the case. And you can kind of look through this before you push down and make sure they're lined up. And then you just kind of push this thing down. And if for whatever reason, if you get this on there and it's not quite lined up, then I'll just take the hex driver and you can kind of massage this thing into place. But this one's actually on there pretty good. But if you needed to, you can use the hex driver to align it. Finally, the next thing, you get out the 2.0 millimeter driver and you put these screws in. And I like to start all my screws, especially on new kits, with a hand driver, not a power driver, because I find that it's really easy to get these screws in crooked using a power driver. And I just like to put them in a little ways and look at them to make sure they're straight. And I thread all these in here. All right, that one's not cooperating, but I thread all of these in here. Just a little ways. Again, checking that they're in there straight. You can use like the Outdrive as kind of a guide too if you need to. Get them in there just a little bit. This, you can do it. I'm doing it in a star pattern. It's a good habit to just think about when you're putting screws in diffs to follow the star pattern. But for this first part, because I'm not tightening it down, it doesn't really matter what order you go in. But you'll definitely want to tighten them down in a star pattern to make sure everything seats correctly. Stick that out. They all look like they're pretty aligned pretty well. So then once I get all these in here, the last step I like to do, not everyone does this, but I like to do it, is I just get out my grease again, and I put a little dab of grease at the tops of these screws. And as what that does is when you go and you tighten this down, I just find that it gives a little extra seal in that hole, which helps to just make sure these things don't leak. And if for whatever reason you get a leaky diff, or if the diff feels a little tight when you get it together, you can consider using 2 of the main diff gaskets to seal it. So these screws are all feeling like they're pretty straight. I just like to make sure they're all straight. So then once I get these screws all started and in there straight, then I'll bring out the big gun. I like the Dewault gyro driver. These are really just excellent drivers for RC. You can control the speeds, which is nice. You can control the torque. For bringing these in, I'm going to go full torque, but I'm not going to tighten them all the way down with full torque. I like the hand tighten the screws as well, just so I can feel the torque. So I'll just bring them in to where it's pretty close with the power driver. And I don't like to go super fast because these screws can heat up and they can potentially melt the plastic. So I don't go like crazy fast with these, which is one of the things I really like about the Dewault gyro. So now I just come in here with the final touch, tighten them down by hand in the star pattern. You can see some grease kind of spooging out of those screws. The very end, we can come in here with a rag. I mean, it really doesn't matter too much because you should run a little grease on your diff anyway. They're gonna get greasy, but you can clean that off if it bugs you. I'm kind of anal and a neat freak, but then you just spin this thing around and make sure everything's free in it, which feels really good. And kind of the final touch I like to do, I like to take a Sharpie and write what weight oil I put in here. And so this is 10K. I like to use a silver Sharpie because it shows up really well. And that just lets you know what you put in there. And you can, you know, if you decide that this thing, you want to take the 10K off, then you can just use some motor spray or electronics or brake cleaner, and that 10K will come right off. You just spray a little on it and wipe it with a shop towel, and it comes off. That is how I build my diffs, and you know they're really successful at not leaking. One thing I have noticed is sometimes diffs, you'll see this in the center diff a lot too, just because it's outside of the gearbox and you notice it. But sometimes you'll get oil, like, I'm not sure if these ones go all the way through or not, but on the Technos, if you build one of those, these holes go all the way through, and you'll get oil coming out of those when you first drive your car, and you'll think your diff's leaking, but it's just the oil coming out of those holes. So a lot of times I'll just stick the smaller hex in there and push all the oil out. You could potentially try to clean it out with something, but I don't like to do that because I don't want that cleaner getting in to where we just sealed. So you can look out for that. You know, your center diff, the first time you run it, might spray a little, and just wipe that off and run it again. And if it continues to do it, then it's leaking, but otherwise it's fine. You know, it's probably just some excess oil that's flipping off of it from the beginning. All right, well that wraps up the build. I'm not gonna bore you guys with building the other two. It's the same thing. You know, this one just has a gear on it, but it's the same build. These plastic gears, you have to be careful to not over tighten them. You know, you really don't need to wrench any of these down super tight, but you have to be careful not to wrench super hard on these plastic gears or you'll warp them. But other than that, this build is the same way. So I hope this helps you build leak-free diffs, and hope you will continue to watch this build series. And if you like this channel, subscribe. Take care.